At approximately 9:40 on the morning of November 1, 1755, as church bells rang across Lisbon and thousands gathered for All Saints' Day Mass, the ground beneath Portugal's capital convulsed with a force few in Europe had ever experienced. Stone-vaulted ceilings fractured. Entire streets rippled and collapsed. Within minutes, one of the wealthiest cities in the Atlantic world was reduced to ruins. Survivors fled toward the open waterfront of the Tagus River seeking safety, only to watch the water withdraw and return in a towering surge that swept away ships, quays, and the crowded squares along the harbor. Fires ignited across the shattered city and burned for days. By the time the shaking ceased, the waves receded, and the flames died. Lisbon had been transformed from an imperial capital into a landscape of devastation. Mid-18th century Lisbon stood at the center of a global empire. Portugal's dominions stretched from Brazil to Angola, from Goa to Macau. Wealth from Brazilian gold and diamonds poured into the city, financing grand churches, palaces, and monasteries. The royal court of King Joseph I presided over a society deeply shaped by Catholic faith and imperial commerce. On All Saints' Day, one of the most important observances in the liturgical calendar, churches were filled beyond capacity. Candles burned in sanctuaries across the city when the earthquake struck. Modern scientific estimates place the magnitude between 8.5 and 9.0, originating in the Atlantic Ocean southwest of the Iberian Peninsula along a complex tectonic boundary. Contemporary observers reported at least 2 or 3 violent shocks over a span of minutes. Buildings that had stood for centuries failed rapidly under horizontal and vertical motion. The dense medieval quarters, with narrow streets and heavy masonry construction, proved especially vulnerable. Major religious institutions, including the convent of Carmo, suffered catastrophic damage. Palaces and administrative buildings near the Ribeira waterfront crumbled. As structures fell, survivors sought open ground. The broad square at the riverfront, the Terreiro do Paco, became a gathering point. There, according to numerous accounts, the sea withdrew unusually far, exposing the harbor floor. Approximately 40 minutes after the initial tremors, a series of tsunami waves struck. Estimates vary, but waves several meters high inundated low-lying areas of Lisbon and other coastal towns in Portugal and Spain. The surge destroyed ships anchored in the harbor and swept away those who had gathered along the waterfront. The tsunami traveled across the Atlantic, affecting the coasts of North Africa and reaching as far as the Caribbean, though with diminished force. The earthquake's reach extended well beyond Lisbon. Significant damage was reported throughout southern Portugal and parts of Spain. In Seville and Cadiz, buildings were damaged and populations alarmed. In Morocco, particularly in cities such as Fez and Meknes, the shaking caused casualties and destruction. The broad geographic impact underscored the scale of the seismic event. In Lisbon, however, the disaster did not end with the shaking and the waves. Fires ignited almost immediately, likely fueled by overturned candles from church altars and domestic hearths. With water systems disrupted and streets blocked by debris, efforts to contain the flames proved ineffective. Strong winds carried the fire across districts already weakened by collapse. For nearly 5 days, fires consumed what the earthquake had left standing. The combined destruction from seismic shock, tsunami, and fire erased large sections of the city. Casualty estimates remain uncertain. Contemporary figures ranged widely, and precise documentation proved impossible in the aftermath. Modern historians commonly suggest that between 30,000 and 50,000 people may have died in Lisbon and surrounding areas, though some estimates are higher. The city's pre-earthquake population is generally placed at around 200,000 to 250,000. Even conservative figures indicate that a substantial portion of the population perished or was displaced. The immediate response required rapid organization. King Joseph I survived, having attended Mass in a chapel outside the most devastated districts. In the chaotic hours that followed, effective authorities centered on Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, later known as the Marquis of Pombal. As Secretary of State, he assumed control of emergency measures. His reported directive, focused on burying the dead and feeding the living, summarized the practical priorities confronting the administration. Temporary camps were established outside the ruined city center. Food supplies were organized, and price controls were imposed to prevent profiteering. Troops were deployed to maintain order and deter looting. The dead were buried in mass graves or, in some cases, transported offshore for burial at sea to reduce public health risks. While disease often follows major urban disasters, large-scale epidemics in Lisbon appear to have been limited, due in part to swift burial measures and the dispersal of survivors into camps. The destruction of Lisbon's administrative and commercial infrastructure posed profound economic challenges. Government archives, customs houses, and trading facilities had been located near the waterfront, one of the most heavily damaged areas. Portugal's overseas trade networks depended on Lisbon as a central hub for goods arriving from Brazil and other colonies. The earthquake disrupted financial operations and shipping logistics at a critical moment in European imperial competition. Reconstruction began with remarkable speed. Under Pombal's direction, the government initiated a comprehensive urban rebuilding plan rather than restoring the medieval street pattern. The devastated downtown area, known as the Baixa, was redesigned according to a rational grid layout with broad avenues and large public squares. Buildings were constructed using new anti-seismic techniques. Engineers developed a wooden internal framework, often called the Gaiola system, intended to absorb seismic energy through flexible structural support. Models of these buildings were reportedly tested by having troops march around them to simulate ground vibration, though details of such demonstrations are imperfectly documented. The rebuilt Baixa Pombalina represented one of the earliest examples of systematic earthquake-resistant urban planning. Uniform facades, standardized building heights, and regulated construction methods reflected a centralized vision of order and resilience. The new Praça do Comércio rose near the former royal palace site, symbolizing both continuity and renewal. Lisbon's reconstruction became a landmark in 18th-century urban design. Beyond architecture, the disaster had lasting political consequences. Pombal's decisive management strengthened his influence at court. Over the following years, he consolidated authority, curtailed the power of segments of the nobility, and pursued administrative reforms. The earthquake provided both the context and the opportunity for expanding centralized governance. His policies included economic modernization efforts and the reorganization of certain colonial administrations. The disaster also reverberated across Europe in intellectual circles. The mid-18th century was the height of the Enlightenment, a period marked by philosophical inquiry into reason, nature, and divine order. The Lisbon earthquake posed profound questions about providence and natural law. How could such destruction occur on a major religious holiday in a devout Catholic capital? The event challenged prevailing theological interpretations of disaster as targeted divine punishment. Philosophers responded in varied ways. Voltaire referenced the earthquake in his 1759 work Candide, criticizing simplistic optimism that claimed this was the best of all possible worlds. Jean-Jacques Rousseau engaged in debate over the social dimensions of disaster, suggesting that dense urban living and certain architectural choices contributed to vulnerability. The earthquake thus became part of broader Enlightenment discourse about the relationship between humanity, nature, and society. At the same time, the disaster stimulated early scientific investigation of earthquakes. The Portuguese government circulated detailed questionnaires to parishes throughout the kingdom, asking about the timing, duration, and effects of the tremors. These surveys collected systematic data on ground motion, aftershocks, and damage patterns. The effort is often cited as one of the earliest organized attempts to study seismic phenomena through empirical observation. The Lisbon earthquake therefore occupies an important place in the development of seismology. International relief and attention followed. European courts expressed sympathy, and financial assistance arrived from various quarters. The scale of the catastrophe, widely reported in pamphlets and newspapers, made it a subject of continental concern. Lisbon's destruction was not perceived as a local incident but as a European event with global implications. The social impact within Portugal extended beyond immediate casualties. Many religious institutions lost property and influence due to the physical destruction of monasteries and churches. Pombal used the moment to assert greater state oversight over ecclesiastical affairs. In 1759, a few years after the earthquake, the Jesuit order was expelled from Portugal and its territories, reflecting broader tensions between secular authority and religious power. Economically, reconstruction required substantial resources. Brazil's gold revenues were directed in part toward rebuilding. trade gradually resumed as port facilities were restored. Though the disaster strained Portugal's finances, it did not result in imperial collapse. Instead, it accelerated certain modernization efforts, even as it exposed structural weaknesses in the empire's economic dependence on colonial extraction. Culturally, the memory of November 1, 1755 remained deeply embedded in Portuguese consciousness. Annual commemorations reinforced awareness of the city's vulnerability to natural forces. Architectural codes in Lisbon continued to reflect lessons learned from the catastrophe. The regularized urban core stood in contrast to older, less ordered districts that survived or were later rebuilt with fewer structural innovations. Modern geological research has refined understanding of the earthquake's origins. The event is associated with the complex interaction between the African and Eurasian tectonic plates. The region's seismic history indicates that large offshore earthquakes, though infrequent, pose ongoing risk to southwestern Europe. The 1755 event remains one of the most powerful recorded in European history. The Lisbon earthquake also influenced thinking about disaster response and urban resilience. The integration of engineering, centralized planning, and administrative coordination provided a model studied by later governments confronting natural catastrophes. The systematic gathering of eyewitness data contributed to the gradual separation of scientific explanation from purely theological interpretation. Yet despite reform and reconstruction, the human cost endured. Entire families disappeared in a matter of minutes. Social hierarchies were temporarily flattened as nobles and commoners alike sought shelter in tents beyond the ruin center. The scale of loss required collective adaptation. The rebuilt city did not replicate what had been lost, it represented a deliberate reimagining shaped by catastrophe. By the late 18th century, Lisbon had re-established